Our principal thoughts belong to God, not to the world. Let us hold the profession of our faith without wavering. What will I do? I will fear no evil, for thou art with
All right, it's good to see everybody here today. Let's go to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. And we'll be looking at verses 39 through 52 today. I want to look here at a 12-year-old Jesus. Child prodigy, I would say. Yesterday, I was thinking back about my career in education as an educator. A lot of time has passed, and in 2 years, if I decide to, Nancy, I can lay down the chalk. We don't use chalk anymore, but we did when I started. I used chalk, and that's a pretty good feeling to know if I want to leave it that I can. But I was trying to think of all this time and all the students that I've seen. I've estimated, I think it's around 3,000. It might be a little more. I tried to think, who was the smartest student I ever had? And a few names came to mind. A few popped in my mind, but I never could really decide for sure. I've had a lot of bright kids come through. They've gone on to, be successful. And some surprised me a few times in some ways. But I can't say that I ever saw a child prodigy. Can't say that. Some bright kids, but not a prodigy. When we see a child display mastery level skills in any area, like mathematics, languages, art, music, we're amazed by that because it's so rare. We just watch in awe to see a child really perform mathematical equations in his head or have mastered an instrument at a very young age. We look at that with awe. And a classic example from history is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the famous composer. He was a true child prodigy as far as the definition of what that is. He was born in 1756. He started playing music at the age of 3 and composing music at age 5. That's just astounding to me. By the ages of 6 and 7, he had toured Germany, England, France, and Italy, playing for people. And he wasn't playing in rundown pubs or anything like that. He was playing for European royalty at 6 and 7 years old. A master at that young age. He could transpose music instantly in his head. His musical memory was impeccable. At 14 years old, he could hear a complex piece of music once and then write it down perfectly. And when you're talking about a classical piece of music, that's not a 2.5-minute single that you hear on the radio today. You're talking about a long, complex piece of music. Hear it one time and write it down perfectly. That's a prodigy. And what a gift he had, but many times we see people with exceptional gifts at such a young age, they don't live very long. And Mozart's an example of that. He died at 35 years old. 35. And we see that in a lot of cases. I guess the closest thing to a child prodigy in gospel music that I know of would be the pianist Anthony Berger. He started playing piano at the age of 3. He came home from church one day. The choir had sung a song, The Old Rugged Cross. And he came home to his house at 3 years old, sat down at the piano and picked out the notes on that song that the choir had sung that day and never taken a lesson. And hear him tell the story. It took him 2 years to find piano teachers because nobody wanted a 3-year-old. And so he died at the young age too, 44 years old. And so we see that people with exceptional gifts, typically, for whatever reason, they don't live a long time. But I think Jesus we could put in this category as maybe the pinnacle of what a child prodigy would be. And this is the only scene that we have of him as a child, and that's what I want us to look at today. Starting in verse 39 of Luke chapter 2, we'll pick up there. It says, "And when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew," this Jesus of course, "and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him." Now, Luke obviously records the birth of Jesus. We have talked about the angelic announcements of John the Baptist and Jesus earlier a couple of weeks ago. But Luke does record him being presented at the temple up above this in chapter 2 as a baby. But he does not record the family going to Egypt. He does not record the wise men coming to visit Jesus, the Magi, or them having to flee Herod and go into Egypt. And why he doesn't include that, I don't know. Matthew's gospel is older, according to the early church fathers. Maybe he was familiar with that gospel and did not, since he had already recorded, maybe he didn't feel a need to include it in his narrative, but he doesn't. But they did not go to Galilee until after that, until they came out of Egypt. And in fact, Joseph must have intended to live in Bethlehem because the text says that an angel warned him not to go back to Judea, the area of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So he must have intended to live there. And then when the angel warned him, they decided to go back to Nazareth. And so that's where Luke picks up here. And so we don't know anything about this time period. From the baby Jesus, we know that he's around 2 years old when they go to Egypt. Then he comes out of Egypt, which of course fulfills a prophecy of the Old Testament, as Matthew states. But then from that point until he's 12 years old, we see nothing. There's complete silence. And I'm thinking about that because sometimes we forget these are real people. These are not fictional stories. This was a real family, a real day-to-day life, just like you have. And Jesus had other siblings. He had brothers and sisters as well. We don't know when they came along exactly, but we do know they did not believe in him until after his resurrection. And so, that made me think, if Jesus lived a sinless life, and he's at home, he's the oldest of this family, and he has these younger siblings, were they jealous of him? As siblings can be. When they would get in trouble, because I can't see Jesus getting in trouble if he lived a sinless life. You ever thought about that? How did the other siblings react to that? Well, Jesus never gets in trouble. You always get in trouble for this or that. He's the favorite, this kind of thing. We don't know. What was the daily life around the house with a perfect child? Now, I've met some parents that thought they had perfect children. But this is an example of a perfect child. So we don't know anything about him. Then we get this episode when he's 12 years old. So let's pick up in verse 41. "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom." Now, because of the captivity, if we go back into our Old Testament history, remember Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. That's roughly 600 years before this. And Israel was completely dispersed. The northern 10 tribes had already been dispersed. And then Judah and Benjamin were dispersed later. And because of this, the synagogue system was created, and some of them never came back to the land after this. And so every year for Passover, it was impossible for all of these people, all of the men, to come back for all of the feasts that they were required to. So a lot of them chose just to come back for Passover. It would have been the most popular with the most people there in the city. The women were not required to attend, but they could. And it was considered a sign of devotion, true spiritual devotion if they did. And we can see here in the text that both parents, Mary and Joseph, went every year, was their custom. And so they were devout. It tells us that they were devout. And so God knew what He was doing when He chose these two people to play a part in His plan of redemption. Now, at the time, this would have been about an 80-mile journey to get from Nazareth to Jerusalem and take about 3 or 4 days. As we see later in the text, they didn't travel alone. There would have been a caravan of people, of family members, maybe friends and acquaintances, people that lived there in the community. And Jesus is 12. And so this is an important time for Jewish boys at this age, because the Jewish boys became accountable for keeping the law at age 13. And so this is a year removed from that. Later on, a ceremony developed because of this that you probably heard of today, the bar mitzvah. Orthodox Jews still practice this today. They have the bar mitzvah at 13, and they didn't have that at this time. That came later. But bar mitzvah means the son of the law. And so at 13, this is the age he becomes accountable. So Jesus, he's coming there at 12. He always went, more than likely, is from what the text says. But this will be very important because he's getting, for all the Jewish boys of this age, he's getting close to that age of 13 where he is held accountable to the law. Now, Luke doesn't give us any details of anything that happened in particular during the feast of the Passover, which would have been about 8 days that they would have stayed there. But then we're told in verses 43 to 45, here's where the story gets interesting. Because when the feast had ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, and his parents did not know it. But supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey, but then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances in that caravan. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. And so, I was thinking about that. This seems to be the classic case of parents thinking they know where their kids are, but they don't. Because we know it's not Jesus' fault, because he never sinned. So it can't be his fault. We can't blame it on him. So this is Mary and Joseph. You would think they would do a head count. Okay, I got Jesus and James and Jude and Joseph and all the ones before they leave. But for whatever reason, they didn't do that. Now, all of us can relate to this situation in some form or fashion if you've got kids. Because, whether you've been in the grocery store and you got one of your kids following you along with the cart and you're not paying attention, you're shopping, and then all of a sudden you look back, he's gone or she's gone. Then you got to go up and down the aisles and try to find them. Or maybe you have to do an all call on the store. That's happened. I can think when we were growing up when I got big enough, a little younger than this though, younger than 12, so this has been the late 80s, early 90s. We would go to the mall back when that was a thing in Decatur or Hunt or Jasper. We would just tell my mom, hey, we're going to the arcade, because they all had arcades back then. Hey, we're just going to the arcade. And then mom would just go shop. Now, I would never do that today with my kids, but back then we didn't think anything about it. We just went wherever we wanted to, and somehow there were no cell phones or anything, and we would find each other before we left. I don't know how we did that, but somehow we would always find each other. And so this is not uncommon, to just all of a sudden lose one of your kids. And if you got younger kids now, when they get older, you'll probably experience this. Just a couple of years ago on vacation, I thought I'd lost Isaac. We had gone up to Cades Cove in the Smoky Mountains, and we were riding bicycles around that loop. And Mallory and Caroline's obviously slower, and so the plan was I'll stay with Isaac, Mallory will stay with Caroline. And I had stopped, we had gotten ahead of him, and so I told him, let's stop. And then we'll get a picture right here before we separate, and then we'll go do our own thing. And so he was impatient. If you knew him like I do, you would understand this. So he was impatient, and he finally said, "Can I just go on now?" I said, "Yeah, go on. I'll catch up with you." And so they took a little bit longer of catching up to where I was to take that picture than I thought. So they finally get there. I snapped the picture. I looked at it on my phone the other day. And so I thought, I've got to catch him because he's going to get too far ahead. And so I start riding along. Don't see him. And then if you're familiar with that loop, not very far in there, there's an exit. There's a fork. And I get to the fork and I still haven't found him. And I said, oh no, which way did he go? Left or right? And I was starting to panic because if I get this wrong, we will be miles from each other. And so I took the right, and it's twisty, turny, up and down. I don't find him. And finally, there's a little straightaway right where the Methodist church is. If you're familiar with that area, there's a Methodist church. And in the straightaway, I see a little blonde head up above me. And so I ride up to him, and I pull up beside him, and he says, "Daddy, I thought I'd lost you." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I thought I'd lost you too for a second." But there was that sense of relief, in the panic. Caroline scared us one time, went out behind the house, and that's a whole other story I won't get into, but she scared everybody. It was even worse. And so that happens with your kids sometimes. They get away from you, not on purpose or not anything bad that you're doing. They just get away somehow. And then you go into a panic trying to find them. And then look at verse 46. It says, after 3 days, that's a long time. That is a long time. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Now, 3 days, it says in the text, they had gone 1 day before they realized he was gone. And so it took them another day to get back. And then they find him on the 3rd day. And I thought, seems like I remember another story about Jesus being seemingly gone and then appearing on the 3rd day when he was a little bit older. I don't know if there's any foreshadowing there or not, but that did cross my mind. But he's sitting there with the teachers of the day. Now, that was the traditional method for Jewish teachers. We talked about that a few weeks ago. When Jesus taught in the synagogue at Nazareth, we went through that story. He stood up to read that passage from Isaiah. And then it says he sat down. And then he said, "Today this is filled in your ears." And that was the protocol. In the synagogue, they would stand to read and then sit to do the explanation. And so that's why they're sitting. This was the common method. We see Jesus doing that several times. When he would speak, he would sit down to speak. When he told the parable of the sower, he was sitting in a boat and the people were on the shore. And so nothing uncommon there. And many teachers would have been here because of the Passover. The greatest minds of the day would have been there from all over the place. And he's listening and he's asking questions. Now that struck me right there because that's one thing that my students do not do anymore, is ask questions. I am rarely ever asked a question when I teach class. And it's like pulling teeth to get anyone to respond to anything that I'm trying to say, to get them to think about the passage, because that's what we're doing. I'm dealing with passages. It's like I'm dealing with a passage here. It's the same thing. It's just this is the Bible, and there I'm looking at something else. So I'm trying to get them to think, to analyze things. And in a microwave, I guess that's even an outdated term now, microwave society, an instant society, where they've got everything at the palm of their hand, where they can instantly get everything. And so they don't ask me. The only question I get is, can I go to the bathroom? And that's about it these days. But he's asking questions. And this was the customary pattern between Jewish teachers and students. They would have a dialogue back and forth. You can see Paul doing this in Acts 17:2. You can see Paul going into the synagogue at Thessalonica, reasoning with the Jews. And that's what that word reasoning means. It's a dialogue back and forth, having a back and forth dialogue. Well, we would expect Paul to be able to do that. with Jewish teachers. He was well trained by one of the most respected of the day, Gamaliel. And then his grandfather, Hillel, was even more respected and cited. But this is a 12-year-old boy that we're looking at in this text. And in our culture, this would be a boy in the 7th grade. A 7th grader. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with 7th graders, but there is nothing more immature than a boy in the 7th grade. I used to have a saying at work that people would laugh at, and I would say, you know, somebody in the 7th grade is the closest that you can get to Satan himself reincarnated. Of course, they get a good laugh out of that because the immaturity is just off of the charts. Why are you laughing, right? But it is. And that to me, and just my experience with teenagers and things like that and teaching them for so long, the age here that Jesus is, that makes it even more amazing to me of what's going on. That he's 12 years old. He would be in the 7th grade if he were an American student. But this is no normal 12-year-old, I can promise you. You know, this is Jesus. And then verse 47 says, and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. You know, and I'm sure he was keeping them on their toes, asking difficult questions and answering their difficult questions with ease. And so this wouldn't be the last time either that he amazed people with his words. Just back when we were looking, what did they say in Nazareth in the synagogue that I preached about a month ago? They had never heard anyone speak like he did. Because they said he spoke with authority, not like the scribes and the Pharisees. So there's something different about this man in the way that he speaks. And they even recognize that as a boy. And then they find him. The parents find him in verse 48. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress. Now, like we were talking about earlier, you can relate to that. If you've ever lost one of your kids and had to find them, that feeling, that anxious feeling, that time when Caroline wandered off from the backyard into the woods behind our house and we couldn't find her, I wasn't even home. I was in the middle of the Bankhead Forest. And it was a wonder that I had any service whatsoever for them to get the message through to my phone. And that was a helpless feeling, knowing that there's no way I could get there at any time soon. It would probably take me about an hour to get back to my truck from where I was, just to drive. You know, and I remember riding, thinking, I was on my bike, that's what I was doing, and I can't do anything about it. I can't go look for her. I can't do anything. But buddy, I could pedal because the adrenaline was pumping. And so we've been searching for you in great distress. But why were they astonished? Now let's think about that for a second. Was it by what he was saying? I don't think so. Because I doubt they heard much of what he was actually saying to those teachers, because once they find him, once they see him, I'm sure they just ran up and then she said this. So what were they astonished by? Well, I think it was probably, they were astonished that he wasn't scared. He wasn't out in the streets frantically looking for them. He was calm, sitting in the temple, of all places, and having a dialogue with grown men, experts of the day. What is going on here? I think that's the astonishment. Not necessarily what he was saying, but just the whole situation in itself. And then look at Mary's response. And I know you can all relate to her response. Son, why have you done this? Why have you done this? Why have you treated us like this? You know, that's what we say to our kids when we try to make them feel guilty. You know, when they do something that we don't want them to do, we say that a lot, don't we? Well, you know better than that. Why did you do that? You know, we throw the guilt trip on them, right? And that's what Mary's doing here. It's a classic example of what parents do. When our kids do something wrong, we try to make them feel guilty. So why did you do this? Why did you treat us this way? And then in verse 49, he speaks. The 12-year-old Jesus says something. So let's look at what he says. And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" And those are the first words. If you've got a red letter Bible, chronologically, I know Matthew and Mark come before it, Luke, but as far as a timeline, these are the first words recorded in Scripture that Jesus spoke. And they are the only words that are recorded that he said until he's about 30 years old. The only words. So this is all we have. 2 sentences. From the time he was born until his ministry begins about 30 years old. 2 sentences. That's all we get. That's a long time. Ryan, how old are you? 31. Now, a lot has happened in your life in 31 years. You've gone to school. You have a job. You're married. You have 2 kids. A lot of life has been lived in 30 years, right? 3 kids. You have 3 kids? Oh, yeah. Sorry. You've got 3. 3 kids. So that's even more living, right? So a lot has happened in 30 years. And so think about that. Jesus has lived all of this time. We really don't know anything about what happened except this. We don't know anything that he said except this. Now, being that old, 30 years old, what did people think about that in Nazareth? Because I did some research. I wanted to know what the average age was for a Jewish man to be married in the first century. It was about 18 years old. 18 to 25 was the range. Jesus is much older than that. At 30, when he begins his ministry, and obviously he wasn't married or anything like that. So what did people think about that in the village? How was he viewed? See, we know nothing of that, of how he lived or anything. This is all we get. So we've got 2 sentences. Now, before we look at what he says, as that 12-year-old, I want to preface it with verse 50. Look at verse 50. And I don't think I've got any more slides after this. Joseph and Mary don't understand what he says. In verse 50. He doesn't understand. They don't understand the saying. And it's not the first part of it. Why were you looking for me? It's the last part of what he says. The part about, I must be in my Father's house. Now, that's not the easiest passage to translate in the English language from the Greek text. It's actually pretty confusing. And so I want to show you that. This is probably that's probably the best rendition as far as what it actually says. But here's what it actually says from the Greek text. And this is the exact syntax and everything of how it reads. Of course, did you not know that in the things of my Father it is necessary for me to be? That's the syntax of the Greek. Syntax is how the words are arranged in a sentence. So, in the things of my Father it is necessary for me to be. That's the way the Greek reads. Now, a more natural way to say that in our language would be this. I must be in the things of my Father. That would be a natural way to say that in the English language. The Latin Vulgate translates it this way. I must be in the things which are my Father's. Okay. That seems vague, doesn't it? Like, what does that mean? And so I can see why they didn't really understand it. It seems ambiguous, but it's actually a mouthful. It might be some type of idiom, or, I'm really not sure. But it's obviously a reference to the temple. Everyone has agreed on that through the centuries. That it is a reference to the temple. It is where Jesus actually is at the time, and it's where they find him. And it only makes sense in the things of my Father. But there's actually more here than just the location that I want us to focus on. Jesus reveals two things about himself that he already knew even as a boy. So let's look at those two things and what he says. So the first thing is that Jesus knows who he is, the Son of God. And we can see that in his statement. He didn't say in the things, I must be in our Father's house. Or our Father's things, literally is what it says. Speaking of the nation of Israel, our Father. He says, my Father. Personal possessive pronoun. My Father. Now the angel told Mary, we saw this 2 weeks ago, that Jesus would be the Son of God. That's in Luke chapter 1, verse 35. And then Mark's Gospel, the opening words of Mark's Gospel are this: the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then here's some more examples of eyewitnesses in the Scriptures that affirm that Jesus was the Son of God. John the Baptist, of course. The Apostle John in his Gospel. John also records Nathanael saying that. In John 1:49, Nathanael said, truly you are the Son of God. And then Jesus responds, you say that I'm the Son of God just because I saw you under the fig tree? And then he goes on to say, you'll see more things than this. So Nathanael, of course, all the apostles affirm that. Martha did. Paul, of course, in his writings. The writer of Hebrews did. A Roman centurion did at the crucifixion. Demons did. We saw that a few weeks ago. Satan did. Luke chapter 4. And of course, the Lord himself did. At his baptism, the voice, what did the voice from heaven say? This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. At the transfiguration, the same voice that Peter, James, and John heard. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Is what he said there. So he's the Son of God. And this is what infuriated the religious leaders the most, was this fact. No Jewish person would have spoken like this about God in such a personal way. My Father. And I'll show you that from the Scriptures. In John chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus says, my Father is working unto now, and I am working. And then in verse 18, here's what 18 says. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Now remember that part right there. Equal with God. Don't forget that. Well, we'll go back to it. Here's another example. Matthew 26. This is at Jesus' trial, or mock trial, or fake trial, whatever you want to call it. A sham. So he's standing there, and the high priest Caiaphas speaks to him. You know, I was reading this week. There was a movie, Jesus of Nazareth, that came out, I don't know, late 70s, early 80s, something like that. They used to play it on TV all the time. And there's a great scene in that movie where Jesus is in front of the Sanhedrin. And they're questioning him, mocking him. And I believe it's Anthony Quinn is the actor. He plays Caiaphas. And when I would read this, I would see that scene in my mind where he asked Jesus in that movie, he sits there and he points his finger right at him. Then he says this, I adjure, this is verse 63, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And then what does Caiaphas do when Jesus says that? He stands up and rents his clothing and then claims blasphemy over that. Later on, when they go to Pilate, here's what they tell Pilate in John 19:7. They tell him, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die, Jesus ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God. And so this is what was so infuriating to the religious leadership. And why is that such a big deal, you might say? Why did they just call him a liar or just completely dismiss him? Well, here's why. To us, the word son doesn't have as deep a meaning as it did to them. When we use the word son, we just typically use it as it's a male offspring. You know, he's my son, he's mine. And that's pretty much that's the way we use the word. But in Jewish culture, there was much more nuance to the word than the way that we use it. You see, a boy could not be a son in the fullest sense until he was an adult. And in adulthood, he was considered equal to his father under the law and in terms of accountability and adult responsibility. And then he would receive the privileges reserved for him of being a son and be considered equal to. And the word son came to mean equal to or one with. And so going back to that passage in John 5:17 and 18, what did it say? It said that this is why they were trying to kill him, because he was claiming God to be his own father, therefore making himself equal with God. Equal with. Son. See, there's a little bit more meaning there than what we just see on the surface, the way we use it. And the religious leaders knew that. They knew when he would say Son of Man, is typically the term that he used for speaking of himself, but they knew that that meant equal with God. That's what he was saying. Equal with, one with God. Now we know that's true. We do. But they didn't believe that. Of course. And so back to the quotation here of 12-year-old Jesus. So we can see that Jesus knew who he was. He knows who he is. This wasn't something that was developed later in his life. Maybe at 30 years old. At his baptism or something like that. And then all of a sudden he just has an epiphany. Oh, well, this is who I am. It didn't work that way. He always knew it, apparently. Now, it's very confusing because to me, when I think about this of Jesus, especially even younger than 12, you know, how the human brain physically develops and all that. When was he conscious of all this? I don't know. I can't answer those questions. And I'm not even going to try to get into all of that. It's not necessary anyway. But this is all we're given. And so we know the child Jesus knows he is the Son of God, my Father's house, the things of my Father. The second thing we see from two sentences, and it's mainly just in the second sentence. Second thing, Jesus knew his mission, his purpose. He knew that as a boy. I must be in my Father's house. Must be. I must be. That's strong, isn't it? And from the Greek text, here's what that means. It means it is necessary. A necessity that I be in my Father's house. And this was his divine purpose. He knew his divine purpose. His eyes were already fixed on God's will, God's house, God's work. It's a necessity. I must be. He's not in his Father's house by chance. This is where he must be. He's where he belongs, doing what he must do. Now, there are a lot of statements like this throughout the Gospels that Jesus makes using this terminology, I must do this. But I'm going to stay in Luke, and just go chronologically through Luke. Here are a lot of statements that Jesus makes that are similar to this. I must do blank. Luke 4:43. This is in Capernaum where he says this. I must preach the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns as well, for I was sent for this purpose. His divine purpose. I must preach. I was sent for this. He knows that here. I must be in the things of my Father. Luke 9:22. The Son of Man must suffer. See, these are not optional things. That's not what this word means. It's not a maybe or a possibly. It's a necessity. It's absolutely necessary that these things happen. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected and be killed and on the third day be raised. So he must suffer, he must be rejected, he must be killed, and he must be raised. Luke 13:33. Nevertheless, I must go on my way today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem. It's not a possibility. I must go. His eyes were fixed on Jerusalem. It was the time. It was drawing nigh. Luke 17:25. For as lightning flashes and lights up the sky from one side to the other, so will the Son of Man be in his day. But first, he must suffer. Absolutely necessary. He must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. Luke 19:5. This one's about salvation of Zacchaeus. He says, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. It's necessary for your salvation that I stay at your house today. Luke 22:37. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. And then he quotes it. And he was numbered with the transgressors. He's quoting Isaiah 53 right there. But the scripture must be fulfilled. It's necessary. Luke 24:7. The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise. Must be. Luke 24:26. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? So we're not talking about, like I said, a maybe. This is necessary. It must take place. And so the 12-year-old who said, I must be in my Father's house, becomes the man who says, I must preach, I must save, I must suffer, I must die, I must rise, I must fulfill. And so to sum up the quotation, we could say it this way, I guess, if we wanted to to get the entire scope of it. You could sum it, verse 49 up like this. Did you not know that I must be where my Father's work is being done, and therefore in my Father's house? And then in verse 50, and they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. Now that wasn't the last time either that people didn't understand what he was saying, was it? Many times his own disciples did not understand what he was saying. In a lot of the parables, they didn't understand the parables. He explained some of those to them, and some things he explained to them, but he didn't explain everything to the disciples. I'll show you an example of that in Luke chapter 9, verse 43. And while they were all marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men." But they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying. So they didn't understand that until later, after the resurrection. And then on the road to Emmaus, those two men on the road to Emmaus, they didn't understand what had just happened in Jerusalem. They're walking with Jesus, although they don't know it's him. He's a stranger. And they tell that stranger about Jesus, "We thought he was the Messiah. We thought he was supposed to deliver us." And now they're not so sure. And so they didn't understand everything Jesus had said. We don't know who that second man was. He's not named. But then later on, what does he do? He opens their minds to understand the Scriptures. And then they get it at that point. But they didn't understand until after everything was complete. The resurrection had already taken place. And then let's finish it up, verse 51 and 52. And he went down with them. This is after the fact, so they don't understand what he says and what it means. But it says, "And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man." And then the next time we see Jesus, over in chapter 3, in Luke's Gospel, he's baptized by John the Baptist. And then he's led into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. So then we have more silence from the time he's 12 until he's around 30 years old. And so in this passage, and let's put that, did that just go down? Let's put that back up. If it'll go back up, if it won't, that's okay. That's fine. So we're going to just look at it in your Bible. So when you look at that, when you read that passage in the future, think about this. We actually see the gospel in that passage, in what he says. "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" The gospel's there. Because what do we see? We're not just looking at a child prodigy that was in there schooling the adults. But we're looking at the divinity of the Son of God. He knew who he was. And his divine purpose that must be carried out. So you can even see that in the 12-year-old's quotation. And a couple of chapters over, in Luke chapter 5, here's what Jesus says. Luke 5 and 31 and 32. "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, self-righteous, but sinners to repentance." And that mission was already clear in his head at 12 years old, sitting there in his Father's house, my Father's house, among the things of my Father. That's amazing to me when I look at that. So that you can even find the gospel in 12-year-old Jesus' quotation. His mission, his purpose is to do the will of his Father. His parents didn't understand it, but the disciples didn't understand a lot of things he said. We just saw as well. And so they had to go back to Nazareth, wondering, just what does all this mean? And then watch him grow up, never doing anything wrong, sinless. Put yourself in that situation. First of all, just try to imagine your kids doing nothing wrong. That sounds pretty good. But we won't get to live that life. But they experienced that with him. You know, when you start to think about these things, of the information that we don't know, you know, I know it's not meant to be for us to know it, or it would have been written down and recorded, and it's not really, I guess, important to our salvation. But like I said a week or two ago, this is a character. Well, he's not a character. I'm talking in my literature terms again. But this is a person that could not be the figment of someone's imagination. It's just not possible. And even from 12 years old, he knew his purpose, his mission, and he was there to fulfill it. And we know from the scriptures that he absolutely did. And that's why we've celebrated Christmas over the last couple of weeks. And then that's why we're here today, because of that fact. And God bless you today.